Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Dennis Thankachan, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lightyear. We had Lightyear on once before, about a year and a half ago, explaining their approach to creating a digital telecom lifecycle automation platform for enterprise networks. This time, Dennis has joined me mostly to talk about their State of Connectivity report that dovetails nicely with many of the issues we think about here at Telegeography. We first get into how Lightyear has seen network prices react to global inflation, in some cases bucking the very long-term trend that telecom prices always go down. We talk about point-to-point service in the enterprise network and how DWDM is actually emerging as a more common product for enterprise customers. We get into the impact of AI and other drivers on bandwidth demand, and then cover a topic we hit often at Telegeography, namely where the market is with decline of MPLS and the corresponding rise of SD-WAN. We close out the State of the Connectivity section by talking about where Dennis sees the NAS market from the perspective of what their customers are actually looking at and buying. Finally, we get an update on Lightyear's platform and Dennis's take on the state of automating network inventory and sourcing in the current market. There's a lot to cover here. This is definitely an information-dense episode. So I will let you get to it quickly, but first I'll just say please do like the show, rate it on whatever platform you're listening to, share it with a friend. Anything that you can do to help us, we much appreciate. And as always, really do feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or wherever you can find me and offer up thoughts about the show, suggestions for future episodes, and things like that. Okay, on to the interview with Dennis. Okay, welcome back to the show, Dennis.
Thank you for having me back on, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been about a year and a half, I think, since you were on. So for anyone who might not have heard that episode, could you just start out with just a little reminder of kind of your background, especially because it's not maybe sort of typical to my guests that work their way through the telecom world necessarily, right? But a little bit on your background and how you came to start the company Lightyear.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is quite random how I ended up in telecom, but I've grown to love it. So I have been passionate about software and technology throughout my life, and I've sort of made attempts, starting from middle school, high school, at creating various technology ventures. In college, I studied computer science and finance, and after that, I worked at Goldman Sachs doing investment banking, not with the goal of pursuing a career in finance, but really with the goal of saving up some money and doing something entrepreneurial, really probably in the software space. That was sort of where my passion arose. I worked at a large hedge fund after that, investing in public stocks. It was like a $10 billion fund run by a famous investor named Stan Druckenmiller. And while there, I ended up leading their investment activities in telecom and became a huge nerd on the telecom space. And I sort of came upon a unique thesis around fiber build-outs and quit that job to start an ISP, actually. And in the context of building that ISP, I will say my initial thesis was not really a great one to pursue.
The ISP market is tough. Believe me, I know
ISP market is tough. And without getting into it, my specific spin on it wasn't particularly attractive. But what I did discover was that the business telecom space in aggregate was a lot larger than I thought as an investor originally, and a lot less digitized than I would have thought as an outsider. I was actually quite amazed with the lack of digitization in the space for things like procurement, installs, even things like billing that seem simple.
Can you fax
And
me an order for that circuit, please? Yeah.
and from there, uh, completely changed my thesis to basically determining that if I could digitize many components of the space, there would be a really really valuable enterprise product to be built out in the software space, and that's what led to the start of Lightyear. And since then, that was called like late 2019. I haven't looked back.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, that's great timing, I think, for having fallen into telecom, which I've traveled many paths in the telecom world, and I think most people who are in telecom found themselves in telecom rather than looked to be in it. That kind of seems to be the way it is. It's not even within. It's a common frustration I hear even within sort of computer science and electrical engineering programs. They're much more focused on the sort of software world or maybe even cloud, but not connectivity as we're going to be talking about right today. So we'll get Dennis, I think, a lot more towards the end of the show about what exactly you're doing at Lightyear. But just give us maybe the elevator pitch to start so that we can frame the start of our conversation on sort of the state of connectivity.
So Lightyear is what we call the telecom operating system. That's sort of our marketing term for the product, but it really does encompass what it is. It's effectively a software platform targeted at any enterprise that digitizes and automates the life cycle for your telecom services. So that'll include services like internet connections, WAN circuits, data center space, phone systems, et cetera, aiming to automate the life cycle for those services from procurement through to renewal and setting up for continuous and systematic cost optimization. And within it, we have three core products. We have procurement, which effectively is software that allows you to digitally rather than manually conduct telecom RFPs and manage your installs. And it's powered by what we call the best enterprise centric proprietary data set in the space that continuously gets better over time, aiming to get you sort of the right vendors at the right price. We have a network inventory manager that's effectively like a digital system of record for your telecom services. Think of like what a CRM does for your prospects, doing that for your telecom services, eliminating the need for spreadsheets, and it'll automate things like ticketing and renewal reshopping. And finally, we have a bill consolidation service that handles telecom bill payment for you. So you just pay one monthly bill to us, and we'll audit all of your invoices and get them paid to you. And you add it all up, and for an enterprise that uses Lightyear, you'll see a lot of time and cost savings in your telecom line item.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that this all came about in 2019. When I think back to that time, I was running this conference series about WANs, and it was right at that time where the vision of the future started to kind of emerge. Of, hey, I'm a mid to large enterprise. Mostly throughout my career, I've picked up the phone to my ILEC representative, sales rep, right, and said, here's my RFI or RFP, and what's the price going to be, right? And when SD-WAN comes along, and when the move to cloud comes along, and then after that SASE, and all these things that really shook up the way that as an enterprise I can think about how to source, procure, pay for all of these things in my network. So I think it's been a really interesting few years to see some of these things that I was hearing as ideas of the future now sort of come into reality. So that's where I want to start, Dennis, is looking at Lightyear has what you call the state of connectivity, right? Looking at your customers, I take it, and understanding what they're doing with their networks. So first, just tell us how you developed this report that you guys have been working on via your customers' data.
That is right. So we have today over 350 enterprise customers. A good number of them are Fortune 500 companies, a good number of them are mid-market enterprises, and some of them are also SMBs as well. And we run thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of circuit RFPs. And the quantity we're running grows month over month. The quantum of quote data, the quantum of install data, the quantum of vendor data, geographic data, and the like. we get a really good on the ground feel for what the average enterprise is seeing and or doing.
Hmm.
And thing that we're trying to do, which is kind of in the vein of the what I call the MO of telegeography, which is making
Yeah.
some of this data more transparent, this data that's particularly hard to access, where you guys
Yeah.
have also a really interesting angle that's a bit different than ours. Um, we want to aggregate this data and expose insights for buyers so they can make better decisions. And the state of connectivity report is one of our flavors of attempt at
Hmm.
doing that, where we'll talk about a number of trends. We'll also talk about some average pricing data for the most commodity services that would be purchased. Think like a 100 meg DIA or a gig DIA.
Right, right. Yeah, I have to say, I really like that you guys are doing this because it's not your core business. It's not what you, but it's really useful as an industry for all of us to be able to collectively understand. That's this idea of being able to sort of pull back and say, what's really happening and understand the enterprise mindset better. So, yeah, I was really excited when you guys kind of brought this topic up to me because, again, this is one of the things that I think about, as you mentioned, all the time at telegeography. In fact, right now I'm working on our market size report where we sort of look at what sort of global revenues for all of these products are around the world. So this dovetails really nicely with that. So the first thing I want to talk about, I've been looking at telecom pricing at telegeography for it's scary, but almost 20 years. So this one, and it was really fun to me when I saw you presenting this on a webinar that you guys did. To see kind of what your take on what happened on the ground with your customers. So we got the question a lot. I'm sure that you guys heard it come up as well. With the past few years of post-COVID global inflation, um, everyone who's been playing in the telecom market long enough has known that typically prices are going down. There's sort of like the Moore's law of data transmission and all that sort of thing. Supply is always going up, even though demand is rising. We've just seen telecom prices tend to fall pretty regularly, right? What did you see happen over this global inflationary period? Did that bleed into your customers' circuit prices as well?
Yeah. So as an investor, I would read that bandwidth costs deflate at something like 5 to 10% annually, kind of like clockwork.
I would agree with
And
that. So yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it was fun to sort of enter the space and observe that sort of cost deflation play out in the data. We
Hmm.
would see something like 5 to 10% annual declines in cost per megabit for dedicated connectivity. Again, sort of like clockwork. 2024 was the first year where we began to see that trend bucked to some degree.
Hmm.
And depending on geography from 2023 to 2024, we actually saw cost inflation relative to trend in select markets. In the US, we saw costs generally unchanged year over
Hmm.
year, with some minor fluctuations, but certainly not a 5 to 10% decline.
Right.
So, although that is not outright cost inflation, that is inflation that is somewhat significant relative to trend.
Yeah, it may as well be, especially when you're thinking about like owning circuits for many years, right? It was always baked in the idea that there would be this 5 to 10% kind of decline over the life of that contract, right? So,
That is right. And in certain international geos, we saw cost inflation of between 5 and 15%, particularly like LATAM, Europe, and Asia Pacific. LATAM and Asia Pacific, we saw call it 5 to 8% inflation. And in Europe, we saw quite significant inflation, north of 15%. And I would keep in mind, this is what was observed in what you'd call like on net or near net enterprise building situations.
mm,
I'm not talking about internet exchanges or
right.
data centers where costs generally continue to follow
Hmm.
somewhat deflationary trends. So, but that actually doesn't make up the majority of what the average enterprise is buying. Typically, they're buying a connection to a warehouse, an office, or
Right.
something of that sort, and that's where we saw this cost inflation. And I am. It is difficult to point to an exact cause of inflation in
Hmm.
particular, because inflation in and of itself is pretty multivariate. But
Right.
over the past several years, we had inflated costs for supply of a variety of
Hmm.
hardware goods, intermediate goods, things of that nature, and also significant cost inflation in specialized labor. And these
Right.
dedicated circuits required specialized hardware, specialized labor, both of which that had inflated. We may be seeing that come through to enterprise costs with a time lag. The other thing to note is the US saw inflation dissipate earlier than some of these
Mm.
other geographic markets where, Europe, parts of Asia, parts of Latin America had inflation persist at sometimes higher rates and also for longer. So, although I am not 100% certain that is the explanation, that is what I would
Hmm.
most likely hang my hat on as the explanation for that. And whether or not this will persist for another year,
Right.
I'm not sure. We will see.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because I have heard from at first I'd say definitely, someone who thinks about this a lot as well. I agree with the ideas, there were, chips, fiber, all those physical durable goods were subject to inflation for all the same global forcings that we don't need to go into, right? But specific to the telecom industry, I've heard conversations from the breadth of the industry for looking for skilled telecom engineers, all the way from splicing fiber, to get fiber to the curb to a greenfield building or replace something, all the way up to network management at the complex kind of software level. That there really does seem to be a skills gap now. Potentially, there are some tools that might emerge from the AI world that might help with part of that, but in the end, as I often like to say on the show, it's like you have to dig holes and pull wires through ducts and all that, and someone has to know how to do that, right? So I could see that sort of skills gap being a problem that might persist even beyond our kind of couple years of post COVID inflation.
It'll be interesting to see how that pans out over the years, over time, because uh, on the one hand, I think telecom experienced what all industries experience, which is just
Hmm.
specialized labor went up in cost relative to
Right.
recent years. The unique thing that hits telecom, that also hits a few other sectors, like some forms of anywhere where you need specialized construction, it looks
Hmm.
like there is quite a bit of a supply shortage of that.
Yeah.
And in telecom, that appears to be pronounced anecdotally. So, to your point, maybe inflation here persists, or the cost deflation trend begins
Right.
to dissipate a bit. But
Hmm.
who knows? We'll see.
That's the thing is that there's a lot of potential disrupting factors out here, right? Some of which we're going to maybe even talk about a little bit later, right? So, next part of your report that I personally found really interesting again, because this is something that I think of talking to a lot of enterprises, and I'll set this up by going back again to that idea of like, hey, like late teens. If I can find a word that works for that decade, right? You have SD-WAN coming along, enterprises rethinking their networks in that sense, rethinking their networks in the sense of connecting much more to cloud than to their on-premises data centers, things like that. And one direction that we saw some enterprises go is much heavier on the sort of point to point. So in the way before time, it was a point to point private network, hub and spoke often, and that's what MPLS replaced. It's kind of ironic that in some cases MPLS is being replaced by point to point. But your report mentioned the sort of move, one towards that, and then specifically Ethernet private lines towards really what we would often think of as more of a wholesale ISP kind of market of DWDMs. What have you been seeing there?
Yeah, that what you outline is accurate. So, post the shift away from MPLS, most enterprise connectivity needs are met by commodity internet circuits, either
Hmm.
dedicated internet or broadband connections. However, although in most cases enterprise don't need to privately transmit data from an A location to a Z location without traversing over the internet, which is what MPLS did, but
Right.
In most cases, you don't need to do that. In some cases, you do need to send data from one location to another location without traversing the internet, where things like reliability and security and privacy are important. So, to fill that gap, enterprises primarily went to the Ethernet point to point or Ethernet private line, where you're utilizing an Ethernet protocol to privately transmit the data between those two locations across a route. And that has worked well. You can think of it as kind of like an internet circuit, except between A and Z. And
Hmm.
that is on our product, the Lightyear platform in particular. What we saw is the gold standard RFP choice for enterprises needing dedicated connectivity between 2 points. However, to your point, uh, wave circuits, which are effectively utilizing over fiber DWDM technology to transmit data, have become a lot more popular. And because you're utilizing DWDM, stands for dense wavelength division multiplexing, you're able to get over the same fiber higher bandwidth and more efficiency, so a cheaper cost per megabit in delivery, and sometimes also more predictable latency. So it's
Hmm.
kind of a more effective means than an Ethernet point to point. You could kind of see why that would become popular.
Hmm.
The primary gating factor from enterprises utilizing waves were twofold. Um, One, the bandwidth needs just weren't that high some number of
Right.
years ago between 2 points to take advantage of the scale benefits of the wave. But more importantly, waves just weren't available. The ISPs need to set up electronics that can support DWDM between 2 points to be able to offer the wave service to the enterprise. And they were just fewer points of presence where you could get a wave 5, 7 years ago. Now you can get waves in a lot more places. And also, enterprise bandwidth needs have just continued to creep up like clockwork. And over the past year, what we've seen in our platform, we've seen wave circuit requests growing at a double digit rate year over year, where we've actually seen Ethernet point to point or Ethernet private line requests declining by double digits year over year. And it does look like waves are probably headed to overtake Ethernet point to points. Like, for example, if you
Mm.
need 100 gigs or more of bandwidth, you
Right.
probably can't even get that with an
Yeah.
Ethernet point to point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I like to think about it from that bandwidth demand standpoint. That you know their bandwidth demand maybe comes in sort of step changes, right, where there's new technologies and new tools that come along. Once you had streaming video everywhere, you might have thought, oh well, how much more bandwidth can you need? But I think we're coming up with constantly in the software world, right, reasons for enterprise bandwidth demand to go up. It just what's your take there on particular, of course, as I often have to say on the show, it's 2025, so we have to talk about AI. But when people ask me what's the impact of AI on telecoms, if I'm not thinking about AI being utilized to run networks, then the main thing I'm thinking about is bandwidth demand, right? So, yeah, how do you see that? That's probably not something that gets into the data from your customers, but just how do you see bandwidth demand drivers developing over the next few years?
The interesting thing is that although AI is the technology flavor of the day,
Hmm.
the bandwidth demand growth compounding is relatively unchanged.
Hmm.
AI is not dissimilar from, for example, what streaming did to bandwidth demand, which
Right.
was compounding it some number of years ago. And prior to that, just like utilization of the public internet and applications and software and all of these things have contributed multivariate. The bandwidth demand compounds. And right now, for example, we do see a lot of AI native or AI adjacent companies driving demand for the highest bandwidth services. We also
Hmm.
see enterprises embracing AI tooling that is resulting in need for more bandwidth. Um, Bandwidth demands are multivariate, but I believe that bandwidth needs will compound and over time will go up for different reasons. So right now it is
Hmm.
AI. We will see what how long that continues to drive bandwidth demand compounding. You probably have a few years of that, and maybe it's something else in the
Right.
future in particular. So we do see that growth coming from what you'd call AI native companies. We also see companies that have kind of nothing to do with AI getting 100 gig wave circuits all of a sudden,
Mm-hmm.
whereas previously they were not getting those. And there are a whole variety of factors that go into that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, just at the most basic level, we just as compute gets faster and more efficacious, and as applications get more complicated, then that's good for bandwidth, right? So, and
That's right.
it's no reason for that to slow down anytime soon. Let alone some future world where we have AGI and quantum computing and all of that. That's the bandwidth demand there. Again, something I like to remind the world of, right? But all of that stuff can only work if there is the underlying, transport networks to handle it, right? So, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So kind of going back now to how I set up, talking about point to point and DWDM. It all sort of ties back to that big change that we saw in the enterprise network space when MPLS sort of became less necessary in a lot of cases. So what have you seen there vis-a-vis the decline of enterprise MPLS use?
So over the past several years, we have seen kind of a troughing out of the
Hmm.
decline of MPLS, meaning I think we sort of hit the point of what I'd call at least a short term trough of MPLS
Right.
utilization over the past, call it 2 to 3 years. And, that's at least what we've seen in our enterprise platform users. In particular, there was a period of time early on in starting Lightyear where um, it almost felt like a majority of the enterprises we were talking to were going through a shift away from MPLS in
Right.
some form, or at
Hmm.
least contemplating it, call it like 2019, 2020, 2021. Um,
Yep.
Today, we don't see that anymore. We see the vast majority of enterprises that are using primarily public internet connectivity. And we
Hmm.
see a very small, extremely small number, sub 10% of platform users that are utilizing MPLS for service reasons that are likely to persist for years from here. And
Hmm.
that's sort of validated by survey data. Um,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
particular, that there's the Ariaka survey,
Hmm.
enterprise survey that's released annually that denoted that there are 9% of enterprises that'll utilize MPLS as well as alternatives on a continued basis, and some like 5% of enterprises that are going to actually invest in more MPLS
Right.
over time. And what we observe as the commonality amongst the enterprises that are continuing to use MPLS, um, MPLS is truly the best technology under very specific circumstances that rarely are coming into play for the average enterprise, but come into play for a small number of enterprises, particularly if you have a mesh network topology with significant needs for predictability, privacy, and security.
Hmm.
And sort of perfect quality of service, but you don't really care much about cost or network flexibility, um, MPLS can be very valuable. And also, if making a network change is extremely risky for your profile of business, that can even further compound your desire to stay on
Hmm.
MPLS.
Hmm.
Um, the most frequent circumstance we see that come into place with large financial
Yep.
institutions, so banks, payment networks, sometimes in healthcare, and
Hmm.
also sometimes for large enterprise operations in parts of the globe where sourcing dedicated connectivity is particularly difficult. That's really where we see it today.
You can just say China, I think. So that's all right. Yeah. 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 No, 100% agree with that assessment. And for what it's worth, like I mentioned before, I'm working on this market size model that we do now, and I forecast ahead several years. And we had MPLS declining for a while, but it flattens out and it kind of stays at that point in our model, because like you said, there's a certain group of enterprises that for the foreseeable future aren't going to be able to jump into the public internet SD-WAN kind of world entirely. Depending on those situations, there are still not, it's not just China. Of course, there's other places where reliable public internet is still an issue. Certainly, I think that becomes one of the big forcings there. Um, all of that is tied, of course, to SD-WAN uptake, right? So the curves are in opposite directions, right? The MPLS curve going down and flattening out. The SD-WAN curve has been going up, but I think maybe also flattening out now. Is that how you would see it?
That is about how we see it with an asterisk.
Hmm.
So, a thing that we do now see more of, which is interesting, is rather than MPLS to SD-WAN transitions, SD-WAN to SD-WAN transitions. So,
Mm-hmm.
enterprises are effectively hit peak on rollout of some form of SD-WAN technology. I think this is actually a telegeography data point, but by 2022, in your enterprise survey, one of the
Hmm.
state of the WAN reports had noted that like over 90% of surveys enterprises were in fully installed or rollout phases
Yeah.
of
Hmm.
an SD-WAN,
Right.
and not really much higher to go than that potentially. So
Yeah, there are some that have no use for it. In fact, going back to kind of, I alluded to this before, we didn't really get into it, but we do see some enterprises who act like mini telcos basically, and just kind of build their own backbones and then connect to their cloud instances through DIA or whatever. And in that kind of situation, you're not really replicating the WAN, so you don't need SD-WAN. But those they're unusual, right? So they're that's not going to spread that far throughout the market, I don't think.
yeah, that's exactly right. And that first iteration of SD-WAN was good for the networks as they looked when you were tearing away MPLS, which is basically, oh,
Mm-hmm.
you may have a headquarters and a number of branch offices. And that's basically what you're facilitating connectivity between, and the SD-WAN set up to basically facilitate that effectively over the public internet with the SD-WAN overlay.
Right.
In the new school of the market, you may have branch offices. You probably also have employees at all sorts of different endpoints with remote work. You have much, much more in the cloud and middle mile and peering
Right.
matter. You care a lot more about security. So the new SD-WAN products of today are either evolved versions of the old products from, call it, the status quo providers. There are also a ton of new SD-WAN startups effectively creating new WAN overlay technology products. And we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing enterprises move from, call it, an SD-WAN 1.0 product, reevaluate effectively the use cases of their WAN overlay as they see it and how their underlay WAN has changed, and seek a new version of some form of a software defined WAN product. And
Mm-hmm.
those are transitions that we help enterprises with today. So when we're sort of seeing enterprises buying SD-WAN services, typically they are augmenting or moving off of an SD-WAN that they previously were on rather than an MPLS network.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting that you say that there's startup activity in the SD-WAN space, because again, there's been this big ebb and flow to that like, big ramp up of startup activity in the late teens, say, then tons of consolidation. In fact, some of those early SD-WAN providers are no longer supported. They're sunsetting some SD-WAN platforms, but then because the idea of SD-WAN has moved on so much, then you get another wave of startups looking to fill new niches and that sort of thing. So that's something that I would like to look into more myself, to be honest. So yeah,
Yeah, there are some exciting companies to look at, and the interesting thing is a number of them are founded by the people that founded the original SD-WAN vendors.
as
Like,
always happens, I get
yeah,
frustrated with whoever bought my startup, and I can't move quickly enough or agile to address these new issues. So I got to do a new startup, right? So
that is how
yeah,
it goes.
yeah. All right, so wrapping up our state of connectivity, I want to get to what may be the most difficult part to talk about, right? Because the industry cannot agree on what this means, kind of like SD-WAN was, several years ago when we were talking about this, right? But of course, I'm talking about network as a service, NAS, right? So I want to start with, from your perspective of being involved in the market for selling this to enterprises, how are you guys specifically defining NAS? What does it encompass in 2025?
So today, I'm actually kind of
Agreed.
unable
Yes.
to
Yeah.
define NAS in a broad sense because
Hmm.
we're laid into what enterprises want. And today, the NAS format that enterprises are
Hmm.
most interested in and desire is unclear to me. That may be because of issues with the current iterations of the service. It could be because of confusion. It could be because of
Hmm.
lack of doctrine. It could also just be immaturity of the service overall. So, the way I would define NAS is service that can deliver you with scalable on-demand network infrastructure that can be provisioned and consumed kind of
Right.
like your cloud software or public cloud services are, kind of as a service. And that can mean a variety of different things depending on the vantage point of which vendors you're looking at. Initially, we had data center and public cloud providers that were offering NAS products called, like, for example, Google Cloud offers an interconnect cloud router and cloud firewall products. Equinix
Right.
has their Fabric product. These are effectively network as a service and meet the definition of what I was talking about. More recently, and I think this is most frequently referenced when you're talking about NAS, you have telcos offering NAS solutions, and you also have focused startups offering NAS
Right.
solutions, kind of like Megaport or Packet Fabric, and these are quite different. So, for example, Verizon and Lumen have NAS services today, and with Lumen, you can sign up and digitally purchase network services with usage-based pricing and
Mm.
quote unquote on-demand flexibility, which feels like how you
Right.
would purchase a SaaS solution online. And same sort of thing with Megaport, you can sort of sign up, get set up, pick a point of presence, and then almost click and get bandwidth and click to upgrade your
Hmm.
bandwidth, which can feel magical. However, with all of these services, you still need to
Right.
install and provision a physical circuit in most cases, which faces the same challenges and complexities
Right.
you'd find um, in the real world deploying a physical circuit when you purchase a DIA from one of these vendors. Um, these services can actually work well in our observation and almost be a little magical in areas where connectivity is
Right. The
plentiful
data
and
center to
bandwidth is
data center
plentiful and
model
can be easily
always made the
provisioned. So
most sense
think like
here
internet.
because there's enough over provisioning there that there is slack that can be utilized immediately, right?
Exactly right, and the connectivity is cheap. And this works less well in areas
Hmm.
where that isn't the case, where these products effectively don't work or don't support much. And that is the
Right.
majority of where enterprises face issues buying connectivity. Not to say that there are no issues buying connectivity in a data center, it's just a lot less of a problem in our experience. And installs are easy, pricing is lower. Most of where buying connectivity is hard is in the on net or near net building or physical facility space. So the other thing we've observed is that when you're buying services from these NAS
Hmm.
providers,
Right.
they'll come at a cost premium, at least today, relative to you just buying that circuit in the real world. So you may get some flexibility and you may get some ease of use and a UI that's nice,
Hmm.
but you'll pay a premium for that if that's okay for you. That's sort of one iteration of NAS, and that's what I think is most commonly referred to. And then third, there are NAS startups that are focused on kind of turning the LAN
Mm.
into
Hmm.
an OpEx rather than a CapEx. And they will offer you hardware, software, and managed services to basically set up your local area network, manage your local area network, and also some security services and
Right.
um, smart hands type support to help you with a variety of things, with some SLAs on certain types of
Right.
support. And basically, you can outsource your LAN management, which is kind of like a managed Wi-Fi plus type experience. That's quite different than the telco NAS
Hmm.
offerings, but that is another offering we're seeing out there. Um, and the commonality amongst all of these NAS offerings is we're not seeing a ton of enterprise demand today
Right.
for them. However, we are seeing interest and questions. So perhaps the demand does come. We'll see.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that because we agree, right? So I've asked enterprises this kind of question over the years, and I think a lot of enterprises have struggled to really see the use case outside of those who have an obvious one, like something that's very seasonal, retail, that kind of thing, or event companies that might run a stadium that has no one at it 5 days a week, and then there's 30,000 people there, and that those kinds of situations where there's an obvious ebb and flow to traffic. I think for most enterprises, they've been largely kind of like, what does this really get me? Provisioning time is a pain, yes, but that's not, you still can't do this end to end except in very limited circumstances, right? And the other thing that you mentioned with the LAN services of moving LAN away from being an OpEx to being being a CapEx to being an OpEx is, I think enterprises struggle with that for the whole network kind of idea, right? Of looking at network is infrastructure, right? Whereas software and the move to cloud and everything as a service, that's not quite the same thing as this sort of physical infrastructure that belongs to you for years. And I think above all else, there may even have to be a change on the finance side, the way that sourcing teams think about networks for a lot of what the carriers are really talking about in the NAS space to ever come to fruition.
That is correct. So I think when you saw the shift to or the as a service revolution for software, there
Hmm.
was a true technical innovation in addition to a business model innovation in the
Right.
sense you no longer had to host software. You could get constant updates to your software without
Hmm.
having to administer or pay for those updates yourself. That was a true benefit to the enterprise. And also, you didn't have to pay hefty licenses when you buy software. You could sort of push that out. On the other end, there was a business model innovation. In this case, it looks more, at least today, like there is more of a business model change rather than a true technical innovation being had. And for many enterprises, I think losing control over your LAN or um, using a nice UI to buy a circuit when in reality the actual circuit delivery isn't necessarily fixed or you can't get it where you need it or you may pay a
Right.
significant premium may not be particularly attractive.
Hmm.
However, I don't like to be a doubter on new technologies as a person that administers a new technology in Lightyear
That's
myself.
right.
So
Yeah.
we will see. And if there's real demand for these products somewhere, we'll figure it out because I'm sure that the people running these companies are very smart and
Yeah.
will augment their products to meet the enterprise need that's most salient.
Yeah. Yeah. No doubt. I think some of it has to just come from, honestly, education. To network managers are busy. It's a hard job, right? They like we mentioned before, they're lacking skills to hire people often, and it's a matter of getting to a point where what you're presenting to the customer they can so easily understand and see the benefits of. And I certainly think that may come. I just don't see us being quite there yet, right? So yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, all right. So, Dennis, let's wrap things up here. Last time that you were on the show, we talked a lot about kind of what Lightyear was doing in the marketplace. You described a bit at the top of the show here, but I want to just get into maybe what has happened in the last year and a half, kind of what developments you've had at Lightyear, and how you're pushing, kind of related to NAS in a sense, right? Pushing that sort of digital environment for sourcing this telecom infrastructure forward.
Yeah. So at the time that we last spoke, which was about a year and a half ago, we were the only real software product out there to manage your telecom lifecycle and particularly digitize the procurement experience for telecom. And today, we are very much still the only software company that is doing that, which is cool. And
Yeah.
we've gone from more of a call it SMB and mid-market type offering to a true enterprise offering, which
Mm-hmm.
represents the majority of our customers from a revenue perspective today. So some of the changes we've made to our product additions and growth is first we launched the bill consolidation product more formally. That is the product where previously we had procurement and network inventory management, but now we can handle bill payment for you. We can digitize your bills. We can audit your telecom bills and make sure you're paying the right amounts. We can dispute vendors on your behalf to save you money and ensure that you're billing properly, and basically reconcile and track your circuit inventory from a configuration and contract perspective against what you're actually paying and using month to month. Second, we offered new dashboards for our network inventory and bill consolidation services, to where now we have these dashboards and this global search function where you can effectively see all of these aggregated insights on your network, like spend over time, changes in network, changes in bandwidth, changes in configuration, and also opportunities to save money across your contracts and your spend over time. We launched an API, so now you can tie Lightyear across all of your enterprise systems and make sure the data is up to date in your ServiceNow, your Splunk instance, another ERP tool, a homegrown system, and keep things up to date. And you can also even push requests to Lightyear from those sources. We've also added a lot of LLM powered back-end improvements for support, where these are not yet features that are fully exposed to our customers, but a lot of our backend is getting improved via LLMs to improve your support experience, your installation experience, your Q&A answers, and we're also going to expose some features to the customer here. Right. So a variety of changes, and it's also worth noting on the business end, since we've chatted, we now work with over 350 enterprise customers and 5,000 enterprise users. That's a lot of growth since we last chatted, where we never published those numbers, including a number of the Fortune 500. We also raised a $31 million Series B financing round.
Nice. Well. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that particularly, like, there's so much rapid development, I think, in this space, that we have to have the space and the budget, right, to figure out the next steps. You mentioned an API that's a customer-facing API, I take it, where the customer can employ that to utilize your tool better, to integrate it into, I don't know if you guys are calling it this, but it sounds like you're talking about kind of some TEM tools and things like that. What about on the other end? How do you see the industry developing there? And by the other end, I mean on the carrier-to-carrier side. So a lot of what you're trying to do and getting funding for moving this forward, all of that ultimately does, I think, depend on, to some degree, how well the carriers can provide you with this information, can look across each other's networks and sort of be able to get your end customer what they need. What's your take on how rapidly and effectively the industry is moving into this digitized network information, network sourcing, provisioning, all of that kind of ecosystem that will enable you to offer this service to the enterprise?
Carriers today do have APIs available, some of them. Some of the major ones do. However, in practice, the APIs are not particularly useful. To give you an example, there are a few major carriers that we've worked on API integrations with, and what we find is that the APIs will return you sort of instant pricing or instant serviceability responses, and then we'll cross-check those against actual manual quote processes and manual infrastructure validation with their team, and the pricing is wrong and the serviceability is wrong. So there is an API available, but in practice, what the enterprise wants is a circuit delivered,
right?
And they want an accurate and good price.
For the price they were quoted, right?
Yeah. Exactly right. And so whether or not it's instant, whether or not it's via API, the enterprise doesn't care if they don't get to their end. So there are APIs available. In the way they are intended to be used, we are often unable to use them, unfortunately. And we are able to, part of the reason why a year and a half ago we were the only one, and today we're also still the only one, is because building out the infrastructure to provide the service that we want to deliver is quite difficult. And
Right.
we are further along on our end in our journey to deliver this service to the enterprise via our custom built integrations with vendors and how we gather this data, how we quote. But I wish I could sit and tell you, oh yeah, there's 50 APIs, we plug into them, we get the answers, and that's it. And you just click and you get an instant quote. That's unfortunately not how it works on our end, but maybe that's a blessing in disguise for me because it makes it difficult to build Lightyear.
Yeah, I guess so. Right? Yeah, exactly. When it's truly digital, the barrier to entry will be much lower than it is now. Right?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure some of your Series B funding there is going to personnel development to get more people to manage inventory and rather than necessarily just technological software development. Right?
That is right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I wonder then what you think about, sort of the industry working on this. So, I'm sure you're familiar with MEF, who's kind of trying to bring carriers together for this problem. Do you see this problem, and by this problem in this case, I mean fairly specifically what you mentioned, like even if we have an API where we've gotten our APIs to agree on field names and all this kind of thing, that the information isn't stored in a way that can be utilized across platforms and whatnot. Do you see the industry kind of getting through this in the next few years? Do you see quite a long time before we get to that kind of vaunted sort of digital seamless world?
I believe it will take quite a long time. I'm
Okay.
not optimistic on the carriers getting there. I think the mission of MEF is noble in the sense they want to standardize and add transparency to the industry, which I think would absolutely benefit the buyers. I like the MEF documentation. However, in practice, the vendors that need to adhere to what MEF asks for have no incentive. In fact, they have a disincentive to do so because a
Right.
more transparent, easier to access, where you can compare like for like commodities against one another, result in carrier price
Right.
disclosure and carrier price reduction,
Hmm.
which is bad for them. So I'm just skeptical that that is where they would invest time, even though for the customer it's what is desired. And that's part of why, what I view our role at Lightyear in doing is to add that layer of transparency as a vendor neutral,
Hmm.
vendor agnostic third party, and be a market forcing mechanism toward
Right.
more parity in experience for the customer as a market participant rather than sort of like a think tank, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So I mean, so being paid to lower the friction in this opaque market, right? So excellent. All right. Well, Dennis, has been really, really interesting. Like I said, I think our the way that we're viewing the world sort of overlaps, and I think that's been particularly fun for me to do that rather than, very often here I'm talking about things that I have to do a little homework on. In this case, what you're looking at is what I'm doing all the time. So that was really fun. Thanks for coming along and suggesting this topic. I just want to make sure before we wrap it up, Dennis, that if folks want to look at the state of connectivity report, that how can they find you and what you guys are doing at Lightyear?
Yep. So you can visit us at lightyear.ai. So Lightyear spelled like Buzz Lightyear, Lightyear.ai. And if you go to our ebooks section under resources at the top, you'll be able to find the state of connectivity report. And we'll be putting out more content like that in the future. And also, Greg, thank you so much for having me on. I view us at Lightyear as peers in mission with telegeography. So I love your content as well, and thought this was a fun discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, and definitely we need to revisit this from time to time and see how things are developing because I just think there are so many things to watch. There's so many areas where folks are really excited, and it's going to be really interesting to see whether that's the direction the industry goes or someplace that we haven't quite even thought of yet. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com and we'll see you on the internet.